On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Sara Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego. She is a literary historian who specializes in cultural production of the 18th and 19th century Caribbean across linguistic and imperial boundaries. She co-directed the UCSD Black Studies Project from 2021 to 2025. Her most recent book, Encyclopédie Noire, The Making of Moreau de Saint-Méry's Intellectual World, works with archival fragments to center the world of enslaved knowledge production that made Moreau's research life and academic fame possible. It was awarded the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, along with prizes from the Modern Language Association, the American Historical Association, the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, and the French Colonial Historical Society. Her first book, The Fear of French Negroes, Transcolonial Collaboration in the Revolutionary Americas, is an interdisciplinary study that explored how people of African descent responded to the collapse and reconsolidation of colonial life and the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution. The book traces expressions of transcolonial Black politics in places including Hispaniola, Louisiana, Jamaica, and Cuba, through forms including performance idioms and early Black newspapers. Dr. Johnson is also the co-editor of Kaiso, Writings by and about Katherine Dunham, and Una Ventana a Cuba y los Estudios Cubanos. On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Sara E. Johnson. How are you doing today, Dr. Johnson?
Good morning, Ashley. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm thrilled to have been invited to the podcast. I love listening to it, and thank you for doing this and offering this to the community.
Thank you so much again for being here. So I want to dive in. I have several questions, and then I also want to talk a little bit about this book that is amazing. How did you get into Black Studies, and what keeps you committed to doing the work of Black Studies?
I think that I was drawn to Black Studies before I knew that there was anything called Black Studies, before I knew of it as a field. I come from, on my father's side, my family is all originally from Mississippi. And I was very, very fortunate because my grandmother lived till she was 106 years old, and she loved to tell stories. So I think this is a story that many people hear, that I grew up in Baltimore City, but I spent all of my holidays down in rural Mississippi with all of my beloved cousins and aunties and uncles. And, my dad was one of, over 50 first cousins. And so I was hearing stories and living a history of rural Black community from basically the time I was born. My father went to Southern University and then he went to Howard. He was a civil rights lawyer. He was involved in the first sit-in the Deep South when they tried to integrate the Crest lunch counter in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And then he came to Baltimore eventually and did civil rights work there. And so I just think that I grew up around Black studies in a way. And when I went off to college, I was really fortunate because the first literature class I ever took was with Robert Steptoe, and the next one was with Hazel Carby. And I just had these mentors, these people, I was 18 years old, so I had no idea, right, who they were or what they had written yet. But I was just around people who were really formative in the establishment of the field across disciplines in literature and history. When I came to college, I already knew that I wanted to be a comparative literature major, which is a major that's, interdisciplinary at its core. And we also had an African American studies major. So I ended up doing a double major. And so there was someone in French, there was someone in Spanish, there was someone in all of these different departments who was, working in Black studies. And so I just was exposed from a really young age at home, but then also when I got to college, to people who were working in different languages, different time periods, and who were studying Black community all over the world, really.
So building on that, how do you... Okay, I'm gonna come back I have a question that I want to ask methodologically, right? Because you have the literature background, you have the Black Studies background. Um, how do you but your latest book is very archival research heavy. Like, you did a lot of deep work for this book in the archives. So how do you situate yourself across the multiple disciplines that your work intersects with?
Well, I think Black Studies has always been an
Mhm.
interdisciplinary. And so whether again, if you were working in a Spanish department or a history department or a literature department or, an English department, anthropology, it's always been a field that has drawn its strength from talking to people in different disciplines, working across languages, working just across different formations. When I was in graduate school, well, it's really before that. So I did these wonderful programs. It was called MISREP, and I did MISREP, and it was when they would send students who were often on the East Coast to West Coast institutions and students on the West Coast over to the East Coast. And I was fortunate enough to go to UC Berkeley in the summer, I think it was summer of 1993, probably. That's where I met Eva Taylor. That's when I met Bebe Clark, who became kind of one of the most important influences on me and my growth. And she had originally been in a French department, for example. She worked in medieval French studies, and then she wrote this amazing dissertation on Haitian Revolution. That's how I got into working on Miss Katherine Dunham, because she had been working with Miss Dunham for years. And so, again, the people who were doing this kind of work always were drawing on different fields, right? And so that seemed like a totally normal and necessary thing to me. It didn't seem like I had to make a case for it. Within the comparative literature field, the way I came through and the way I was trained is that we had to do like different sets of exams, for example, right? But we got to make a lot of our own list. And comp lit, there are people in there who are philosophers, historians. I mean, it's really a mixed bag, right? And I think one of the most important things about comp lit is that you agree that you're going to study whatever you study in the original languages, right? And so for me, it was really important. As an undergrad, I went to West Africa for about 6 months. I went to the University of Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, Senegal. So I got to study with people there in French, and I started to learn Wolof. In other words, so like it was in order to answer the questions that came up to me about community and community connections. I was always very interested in Black internationalism in the contemporary moment, like in the moment that I was living, but also in the past, I got more and more interested, especially after I read Black Jacobins and studying this, the age of revolutions. And so it was really important to me to figure out, okay, if I want to ask certain kinds of questions and get certain answers, what do I need to study in order to be able to do that? Which is why, for example, I was like, I actually need to go to Martinique. I need to go to Haiti. I need to go to Senegal if I can. And so I wrote a lot of grants and, anyway, I had a lot of adventures, both in college and graduate, just in school, living all over the place and trying to, look at archives in these different places. For example, I lived in Cuba for a while and, spent time working in the Cuban archives, particularly in Santiago de Cuba, like on the eastern part of the island. Because by that point, I was really interested in the influence of the Haitian Revolution in other parts of the Americas. And so, when I would go to New Orleans, for example, often when I was going to visit family in Mississippi and Baton Rouge, I started working at the Historic New Orleans Collection. And so that drew me into the archives that were there because I was always interested in representation. So, I study literature. I adore literature. I love teaching literature. But I was also interested in figuring out as much as I could about the lived experiences of people. And that demanded that I go and try to find, for lack of a better word, their traces, right? And so that led me into archival work. And then, you mentioned this last book, and a lot of that archival work ended up being done in Aix-en-Provence, which is where the French colonial archives were. They still are. And just doing that kind of work and kind of painstakingly looking through notarial records, looking through whatever I could find to find traces of these people who I knew had these important lives that, in this case, Moreau de Saint-Méry wasn't talking about. I had to go and try to find those little bits and pieces of information. As we all know, and, it's the work of so many important scholars, before me has taught us, the archives are very limited in some ways in what they can tell us because they are always, they treat us often as pieces of property or, they're these little fragments and it might be a name, right? But then, well, that name might be the name that they had for 6 months when they were owned by X, Y, and Z person, right? So in other words, even names are not a dependable way to look up information. And so what became really important to me is trying to figure out methods that allowed me to use the information I was finding in the archive, but not to take it, at face value always, and to sort of, as people would say, read, against the grain or what have you, trying to figure out, okay, what else can I do with this little bit of information I have? How else can I fit it into different pieces of the puzzle?
Thank you. So, yes, it does answer my question, which also lends itself to what you describe as like a communal biography, right? So going beyond one, the intention of the archive and reading against the grain, because what you were able to say from the archive was not the intent that the archive was created with, right? And I thought it was super interesting how so Moreau, he intentionally created this archive for specific purposes. Like that was a goal. But then to take that and invert it in multiple ways throughout the book, even with the images that you include in order to tell a completely different story, was so striking to me. And particularly archival work is not something that I am personally super familiar with before my sister started doing it, right? And so learning more about it through her, who is very influenced by you and by Dr. Fuentes and Dr. Hartman and people who do take the archive and look at it in a different way. It was this idea of a communal biography was so interesting to me. And I'm looking at history in one way, which I know is not the way that traditional history departments or the way that people traditionally approach the archives typically is. So I guess my question is, not necessarily where did the idea of a communal biography come from, but how did you arrive at that as the method to be able to explore this archive in a different way?
Well, the book took a really long time to write. And I think that, it was really unpleasant being steeped in those archives for a very long time. So I'll just give you an example. Because of Moreau, we have one of the only extant collections of one of the most important newspapers in Saint-Méry, right? And and it's because he collected them that we can go back and then, see all the ads for people who have run away and chosen, to live in maroon communities. There's just a wealth of information that scholars have used things like runaway ads or for sale ads for, right? So we can figure out, okay, what languages were people speaking? What were their own community ties? What else was going on in the colony? It's because of him that we have, some of our earliest descriptions of Vodun as a religion. There are just a ton of things that are in there. And what happened though is he also collected every tract and pamphlet and screed really about how old former enslavers, had plans. This is how we can regain Saint-Domingue, right? And they're awful. They call for genocide. They call for all of these things, right? And so when you sit and you read that stuff long enough, you just think, oh, I can't write this book. I'm really not, how am I going to do this? And so I think over a period of time, different methods came to me. I was very influenced, obviously, by Saidiya Hartman's work. They're just a wealth of particularly Black feminist thinkers that I feel like all of my work is built upon. And at different points in the book, different methods, always about trying to figure out how you untell a story that we take as true. So how do I take someone like Moreau, for example, who we've used forever? Literally since he was writing, people have been citing him, right, as an authority on the colonies, not just on Saint-Domingue, because he wrote about, what's now the Dominican Republic. He wrote about Puerto Rico. He wrote about all sorts of places. He wrote about the United States and slavery in the United States, for example. And so I had these portraits of him, for example, right? And so I wanted to do this whole thing with portraiture and destabilizing his image and then building portraits of the people around him, right? And so I literally did that. I literally worked with this wonderful artist named Lou Sandoval, And I gave her tons of information, and like we co-created these, images. She drew all of these images, and she drew his household, for example, right? And then I said, Luce, I need this household again, but only with arms, not with the people attached, because I'm trying to draw attention to the absurdity of slavery, the absurdity of a man who said, "Oh, I can't even tell one Black person apart from another," but that he literally lived off of their labor, their intellectual labor and their physical labor for his whole life, right? He wrote about, Black people. He sold them when he wanted to buy, another book. I mean, he literally profited off of them. And so that's how I think the method sort of evolved. It wasn't just born ready. So one chapter is, extremely, well, all the chapters have a lot of visual work. But, in some chapters I was working more particularly around issues around translation. I was working on, in my last book, I worked a lot with music because I was interested in, we might not have long tracks on the importance of the Haitian Revolution in Cuba or Jamaica, but I have this painting, right? Or I have this song, or I have this particular rhythm. And so for me, it was about building those connections using multimedia kinds of sources. And I think that you see that a lot in this book as well. And that's how it was born. And communal biography, or just community storytelling, you mentioned kinship and you mentioned like alternative networks. So when I drew that picture, for example, or when Moose was working in that picture, and we tried to put all of these people who I have historical documents, like I know that they were there. I know that they were in his orbit, but putting them all together in a room together was very meaningful for me, like representationally. This is what the room would have looked like. These are the languages they would have been speaking in. This is how they were planning their own communities. And it was just a way to, again, reset the imagination, for me, but also for the reader. Like, okay, let's try to imagine this story without him being the center. What happens when, Angelique and Martin are talking to each other, for example. And all, just to bring this back even to like the importance of a podcast like this, I think that when you're working in Black studies, it's a very capacious field, right? It's like we're all building on the work that people have done before us. We're all making connections. We all, a lot of us know other scholars from different places, or we went to graduate school together, or, you know what I mean? Like it's, 1 degree of separation, I feel like, to some extent. And so I think we've always been really deliberate about finding those connections and making those connections in institutions that perhaps might not have supported the discipline strongly, or in places where there might not be a department, there might just be a minor, or in places where there might be a research center, because people are resourced at different levels at different times, across, the decades that have been the field of Black studies. And so I do feel like the idea of communal biography, in fact, in some ways models what it really means to be in this field more generally, right? It's about the people who've taken time to teach us what they know, and, to signal, oh, wouldn't this be interesting? Or what about this? And so those different generations of mentorship and fellowship and just friendly conversations at conferences, whatever it might be, I think the idea really came out of the field and to some extent.
Thank you. You mentioned the 1 degree of separation, but in that you were also been talking about like the different configurations of Black studies across everywhere that Black studies is. And I think that one of the things that doesn't necessarily get talked about a ton is like the administrative side of doing Black studies work in the academy. And I know that you are done doing that for right now, but do you want to say something about the role of the admin in the work of Black studies?
Yeah, thank you for that question. At UCSD, we did not have, when I first got here, thanks to the work, just dedicated individuals who would call meetings and who eventually got a minor in place. And then the minor became a major just in the last few years. It has the best name. It's called Badass, Black Diaspora and African American
Oh, that's
Studies. Right?
amazing.
Isn't that great? Yes, they even had a t-shirt made like, I'm a badass professor. So we have the Black Diaspora and African American Studies minor and major. And then at UCSD, we also have something called the Black Studies Project that was founded again, just with a couple of really dedicated individuals back in 2013. And then it grew. So we got a large grant from the administration, from the university, It was a 5-year program. We're entering year 5 now. And so I co-directed the project with Angela Booker for the last 4 years. And because of this, because we became heavily resourced at this period, it was really, really, it was possible to do all this wonderful work. So we started a ton of different series. So we had a Blackness in Latin America series. We had a Blackness in Europe series. We do all of this work around social justice. We offer fellowship programs. We have dissertation fellows, pre-doctoral fellows. We fund graduate students to go all over the world. I'm not saying all over the world, I mean all over the world. They do these amazing projects like archaeology and, the Midwest, tons of projects in Brazil and Ghana and, New Orleans. I mean, there are projects all over. We have students from economics, from anthropology, from history, literature, music, visual arts. Another series we started was the Black Visual and Performing Arts series. And I mention this because we work with all of these different campus partners. We worked with people in Latin American studies. We work with people over in visual arts. We did this whole series on Blacks in physics. And we worked with, we were able to bring some very prominent physicists to campus. Charles Walker and Nia Mara, just like amazing people who were, interested in these conversations and what does Black studies look like in STEM, right? Anyway, and so we were able to sort of become this hub. It had always been a hub on campus. And then it just grew. And so it became this kind of community gathering space. And one of the things, Angela Booker is in communications, and she's now the provost of the New Age College, which is a college that's founded on on anti-racist pedagogy. So it's a college that's built into its mission is to work around a lot of the issues that are actually really dear to Black studies. And we were both mentored by John Rickford when we were at Stanford, and he's a linguist. He does a lot of work with African American vernacular English, as does his son. And we, he always talked about a life of a mind. I'll never forget it because I was a graduate student fellow there at one point. I think it was when I was writing my dissertation. And we hosted this big kind of how to survive in academia, what to do in the field. It was like this huge, like overflowing with people. And he started talking about the life of the mind and how important it is, no matter how busy we get, to always remember why we're doing what we're doing. And, how you give back, how you mentor people. Anyway, so that became for us one of the ways that we wanted to think about, the Black Studies Project. We just call it BSP, how we wanted to think about BSP on campus. Like, how do we foster a life of the mind? How do we foster community in a way that really sustains people and acknowledges their labor? Because as you know, having hosted now almost 200 podcasts, right? It takes a lot of work and time and dedication to do this kind of work. And so what can we do as an institution, as kind of a hub on campus to make sure that people's work is seen, right? To give them chances to not just gather in times of crisis, but to also learn from each other. Like, oh, this person over in this department is doing X, and I'm working on Black Twitter, and together, oh, this conversation is really fascinating. So it was actually one of the roles that I have most enjoyed playing at UCSD. Really in my career, it felt kind of like the culmination of many years of work doing this kind of work in many different scenarios at other institutions, meaning, at, I'm just thinking even the Omohundro Institute that's based at William and Mary College, they had grants, like on slavery and print culture, for example. So, we sit on different committees and we read different manuscripts and we do all this kinds of work, for the profession and for the field, really multiple fields. But working at BSP allowed me to do all of that at home in a way that was really quite wonderful and sustaining.
Thank you. The importance of being able to facilitate the collaborations and connections and like bringing people together. Like you said, I think that that's very quintessentially Black studies. Like it's what Black studies does. It brings together all these fields and disciplines and ideas and allows these conversations to happen in ways that probably wouldn't otherwise.
That's
Um,
right. That's right. And it pulls from different methods in different fields, so that you can ask questions in different ways, so that you can figure out, that you can think your way around a problem or what seems like a dead end. For example, like a dead end in the archive. Another way I can do this. Oh, there are these amazing visual artists who are doing this in a different kind of way, and with 3D installations or what have you. And so just being able to talk to people about that kind of work is really, it's really sustaining.
So building on that, how do you see your work as a teacher being informed by Black studies um, in multiple ways? I guess both your like relationship and history with the field of Black studies and it being influential in the work that you do. How do you bring that to the classroom?
Well, I love to teach. I should say that first. UCSD has grown exponentially in the time since I came, and I think we now have close to 40,000 undergraduates. So I don't get to teach small seminars anymore. Our idea of small might be 40 people in a room, like upper division seminars. But I do a lot of work with primary sources, whether I'm teaching an introduction to American literature, I'm teaching a grad seminar, and like slavery in the literature, slavery in the literary imagination. That's one of my favorite courses to teach. Um, but I think it's really important for students to be able to look at primary sources themselves, to make their own interpretations, to just see what's out there. So I often teach with a lot of digital humanities projects. It's been one of the things I've been really trying to grow my own knowledge of and around over the last few years. So, the slave voyages database, for example, just as an introduction, like click on every single ship, find out the name, how many people were on board. How do you teach people, even a vocabulary that's, like what does it mean to be call someone a slave versus enslaved versus a person, a mother, a child, a daughter, right?
Mhm.
So I teach with that. I teach with I love the digital Aponte project that Professor Ada Ferrer, she was at NYU at the time, and she worked with a whole collection of artists and translators and students to build this website around Aponte and his book, his Libro de Pinturas. And so contemporary artists recreated books based on the Inquisition records, or not the Inquisition records, but he was tortured before he was killed. And so there's a book where he left testimony about or their transcripts about him talking about the book and what was in every page. And it was a book really about Black Revolution, right? Anyway, they've translated all of these pages, and then contemporary artists did all of these recreations of what that description might have looked like. So she worked a lot with Edouard Duvalier, who is this amazing Haitian artist. Anyway, lots of different artists in different cities, because the exhibit ended up traveling. They worked on kind of reinterpreting this moment from 1812, and it's a wonderful resource for teaching. Gosh, there's so many early American archives where they're trying to bring, such a like serialized literature, for example, pieces that were published in different newspapers and have kind of gone missing. People have like
Mhm.
done the painstaking recollecting them and assembling them so a student can read a narrative from 1789 about what it what life might have been like, and what that revolutionary era might have been like. So I teach a lot with a lot of digital resources. We were talking before this began about your sister's work on Thistlewood, right? Thistlewood's diary. I often teach that, and it's at the Beinecke Library now, and a lot of it's been digitized, right? And so
Mhm.
students being around in all of its horrificness, right? And finding out for themselves what slavery actually looked like at this moment in Jamaica. So I would think I would say that's one major thing I use. There's another website called Invasion of the Americas, and it's a record of all of the different. There's like a fast motion version, but then there's a way that you can click on every single treaty that was made with different Native American tribes and the federal government. But you can basically see how land was, stolen
Mhm.
across really basically until the late 19th century. Anyway, there are just lots of websites that really help students get into the primary sources and see what people at that time were saying about these momentous events. So that's what that's how I'd answer it. That's just one of the ways that I try to bring these stories alive in the classroom, and always giving students a chance to do multimedia kinds of projects. They don't have to always write a final paper. They might do bibliographies, they might do an art project, they might do a podcast. I mean, there are lots of different you know ways that they can work with the material and take what's most important to them,
Mhm.
and build.
Well, thank you for that. One, that there's you named a lot of resources that I am now gonna go look up when I'm thinking about,
There really are so many amazing ones. The Digital Library of the Caribbean. I mean, even, I mentioned Moreau at the beginning, and yeah, Fiche Americaine, this website. University of Florida digitized a lot of these newspapers. Yeah, the John Carter Brown has amazing stuff. A lot of stuff is available for consulting
Yeah.
from a distance, which I think is really also going to change the field, in good ways and bad ways. I mean, there is something to say about going and looking, because you find things that you didn't know you were looking for when you're actually pulling a record book, right?
Yeah.
But, it's hard to find funding to make these trips, to stay long enough to, maybe find what you need. And so the fact that a lot of it is available now, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that was, we went to the Beinecke because my sister, I mean, obviously, she's primarily working with the digital collection from the Thistlewood Diaries, but she had to go see it in person, so we went, and she was able to see it, and it was a very different experience, even just, like,
I'll
knowing
hold
how
those
terrible
papers.
it is, like, yeah, holding it physically and knowing everything that's in it and looking at it, it was a very different experience, and she said it was profoundly impactful for how she continues to work with it, so
Absolutely. The Beinecke, I hadn't really thought about this, but it's kind of right in the center of Yale's campus, and I had never been there. And when I was a freshman and I was taking Introduction to African American Literature, Professor Steptoe at that time did this whole program on Zora Neale Hurston. And I got to participate just as a reader reading some of her work, but it was held at Beinecke. And, I was 18 years old. And that's when I even found out what special collections were, and that that they were original papers. I mean, Beinecke holds a lot of papers and a lot of work that's, really
yeah.
crucial to Black studies, right? And so, but it was my first time even knowing what that meant, and being able to see original records and original manuscripts, or the typescript copies of a novel that we all read just, in printed form. But it's really different when you see, the pieces that I think Richard Wright's archive might be there. I might be wrong, but that's what's immediately coming to mind. But, to see the actual moments where they're crossing out place things and changing
Mhm.
words, to see the process of material and of scholarship being produced is also a very powerful thing. Not just to see the end product, to see all the thought that goes into, and the deliberation, that goes into producing this kind of work.
That's so
Anyway,
important.
really formative for me in its own way.
No, I think you're right, that's so important, and I think that too often, that process is not made plain, or students
Yes.
don't necessarily think about it, right? Like, they don't, one, if they're looking at primary sources, which doesn't necessarily happen in a lot of their classes, um, what it means to look at primary sources, but even outside of that, what it means to go and physically see a primary source and understand that, like, no, this is 300 years old, and you are seeing what they literally put down. Yes, we have the typed version that you can look at, but this is different. Um, and even like you said, seeing what was crossed out, like seeing that thought process, I think
Yeah.
can be very affirming to students in that, like, the first version is
Yes.
nobody's like, that's not the
Right.
finalized version. Everybody goes through
Exactly.
drafts.
That's exactly right. Many, 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 many drafts.
Right.
Yeah, I've really discovered that about myself. The last book really, I think it made my love for writing come alive. It's not that I've always loved to write, but once I started being more experimental with my prose, and, I hate writing first drafts of things. It's very painful for me, but revision can be so much fun, when you're really thinking about word choice and order of presentation and how do I get this point across? Oh, I need a short declarative sentence right here. That kind of it's really a labor that I find very stimulating. And how do I bring what I might have seen, whether it's, on a computer screen or I might have seen in person, how do I bring that document, or what's missing from that document? How do I bring that alive on the page is something
Mhm.
that I find. It's a very thrilling part of the profession. It's hard. Hard is an understatement. It's awful sometimes, I think probably most academics have moments when they love to write and then when they hate it, but I have found it to be very freeing once I realized, okay, there are different ways that I can write these stories that don't depend on long form prose all the time, that allow me to have a different kind of voice, to experiment with, in this case, with like, upside down print, really thinking about the characters on the page and how we ingest information, how the people who were enslaved might have ingested that information. Like that to me became part of the puzzle, part of trying to figure this out. I'm working on two new projects, and one of them is it's kind of rooted in family history. And I have all these interviews I did with my grandmother back when I was a teenager. I have recordings of them, and I've played them a couple of times now at talks. And I've done the work of trying to transcribe them, right? So I've been doing a lot of work with African American vernacular English, which goes back to, again, Professor Rickford was one of my mentors, and I did a lot of work on Creole languages in the Caribbean when I was a graduate student. Some Haitian Creole and a lot of Martinican Creole. I went and enrolled at the University of Martinique and took this class when I was a grad student on Creole, right? And it was amazing with Professor Confiant, with Raphael Confiant, who was helping. He was like the co-director of a Creole research institute. They had a magazine, a journal. He taught classes, but he's most well known as a novelist. But it's been really interesting all of these years later to go back to that project, to listen to these interviews, to really transcribe them, because you can't use just an online kind of track, because they're not going to get how my grandma is. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is said is just as important as what is said sometimes. And when she's switching between linguistic registers, there's a moment where she's telling a story, and I'm so glad I recorded it because I remember her telling this story a lot. But it was a story about her grandmother who lived until she was 113. And so she was not emancipated until, she was in her 30s. My father knew her. I mean, she died when my father was, old enough to know her. She lived in the house with them, right? And so she had lots of stories about slavery times, as she said. And, there's a moment when my grandmother is telling one of these stories, and she says something that the mistress says to her grandmother, right? Her grandmother was a child at the time, but she changes the way she uses a different verb form when she actually gets inside the slave mistress's, the owner's head, and then when she responds as her grandmother. Anyway, it's very easy to miss that, but when you listen to the recording over and over, that clearly was deliberate. Like she was, she was making sure that I knew these stories moving forward, and so that I could then share these stories, right? Because it's very easy to forget them and not even forget them, but to not even know that they existed, right? So it's been really wonderful for you to go back. Again, this is how you started, one of your first questions, like where did I start? Where does my love for the field come? And it's been really, really, really wonderful to go back and sort of re-explore that now, 30 years later.
Thank you. Well, you said that there were two projects you're working on. Did you want to mention your second project?
The other one is it's actually relevant to what we were just talking about, which is, like experimental writing and working with the archives and fragments. And during the pandemic, the 100 Institute started something, they called them coffee tables, right? And they were basically Zoom spaces around different topics. There was one on Phyllis Wheatley. I mean, there were quite a few that were particularly that had a Black Studies kind of focus. And ours, I co-convened one with Sara E, who now teaches at the University of Oxford, and it was called Archival Fragments, Experimental Modes. And we met every Friday for years, and so now we're writing a book. And it's really it's a manual of sorts. It's like, well, how do I work with this fragment? Can I write? One of the entries, for example, is can I write this sentence? And we all experimented with sentences that we wish we'd written in our books, or sentences. Can I say this? Is this too daring? Is it too speculative? Is it too harsh? And, so it models different approaches of working with these sources. And, one of the things we really want to say also comes back to what we were talking about with process, right? Sometimes this kind of work is not done, the final product is what you see, but the way that we come upon our ideas, that our ideas then feed off of the work of other people and, are in conversation with other people that allow our imaginations to kind of flow. That's what this book is about. It's about saying, okay, well, here's a fragment. Here are several different methods you might use to work with this fragment. Anyway, so it's been really quite an amazing process because I've done a lot of co-editing work in the past, right? But this is like it's a process of really co-writing. So there are moments when we're meeting and we're literally like shaping our sentences together and proofing them together and revising them together. And it's been really, really wonderful.
That sounds
Really wonderful.
amazing.
We're
Like,
hoping
I
to
think,
finish that hopefully will be finished this year. And yeah, it's been very fun to work on.
no, that's such an important contribution, both of them. One, I feel like we're in a moment right now where so many scholars in Black studies, particularly women in Black studies, are looking at family history or family stories and bringing those and putting them into conversation with broader things that were happening at the time, or using those to demonstrate like what this time period looked like through the eyes of somebody who lived it, which is phenomenal and amazing. And I've loved reading all of those. um, but then
Me
also
too.
like,
It's been
hmm?
amazing. How many scholars are going back to their own family histories and are working on these issues? Yeah, it's there have been so many recent wonderful memoirs and what have you.
But even that is so important and helpful for process, because
Yeah.
it's creating a space for that to be able to be done moving forward by younger scholars and up and coming scholars in a way that wasn't necessarily uh, encouraged for the established scholars who are doing it now. Like, I think it's showing another process, and then this idea of the process, like just demonstrating that is so necessary. Because a lot of times you can be in these spaces and not necessarily understand like how to do it. Like, okay, go write this paper or go to the archives and find these things. But if you're not explicitly taught or modeled or shown, or you don't have the type of mentorship that is showing you what that process can look like, but also giving you the space to bring in the methods that are going to be most helpful for your current goal, it can be paralyzing. And
Yeah.
so I'm really looking forward to both of those projects, but thinking about process in particular is just so important.
Thank you. Yeah, when you said that, just, you're told to, like, go to the archives and find something. It's like, I remember, particularly in X, you have to page, and every place that you work in, you have to page, you have to page whatever you wanna look at, and it's so, it's the F3 series backslash blah, blah, blah. In other words, even to know the code to read something, you need help, the first time you're doing it, and have all of these documents, that are, at the beginning of every research trip I go in, like, these are the things I'm hoping to look for, blah, 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 this is where they might be. And then I do a summary when I'm leaving, like, this is what I found, this is what I didn't find. Here's, I leave notes for myself so that next time I go, I can start fresh. Even little things like, this is the bus route number you need. This is like, this is how late, this is the time that they might, make production for you, whatever. Just you don't have to keep relearning that. And these are
Mhm.
the kinds of things that it's lovely to be able to pass on. One of my colleagues here is doing this amazing archival methods class in the literature department, and working with students, because our students in the literature program, again, they're very interdisciplinary. Some are working on, like 19th century Mexican print culture. Some are working on, I'm thinking of someone who's doing like a speculative fiction project around Octavia Butler. And, the Octavia Butler archives are here at the Huntington and other places, here meaning in California. And anyway, this methods class, it was the kind of class I wish that I had had as a graduate student, because, a lot of it is about methods and scholarship about archives. But then there's also the really practical part of it. It's like, how do you use them? Where might these collections be? Where should I even start? There's actually a really good article in the William and Mary Quarterly. I'm forgetting now who wrote it. I'm sorry, but it's about Thistlewood, but it's about the trajectory of those archives, them originally being in England and then moving, Jamaica, England, and, the work of Jamaican archivists to bring them back to Jamaica, and then the digitization, and then them being purchased by Beinecke. Anyway, it's a really interesting article that it's about the materiality, and it's about, again, like the administrative structure and the hard work of just individuals to make sure that certain things are preserved. And it was just a piece that I really enjoyed reading, because, again, it makes that process of provenance and who decides what's important and what gets saved and what doesn't get saved and what have you. It made that very clear. I'm sure your sister knows.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to mention it to her regardless, but she's probably read it. She's read a lot of the stuff on the SOAD, as you do when you're working with that particular archive. But yeah, the going and seeing it was it was almost a spiritual experience to have to see that particular archive in person. But it was necessary, draining but necessary. So
Training is necessary. Yeah, I think that's something that people are being more and more open about. Just the toll that this kind of work takes on you. And again, to come back to community, why you have to have community around you to get you through those, through those days.
yeah.
We're not writing about topics that are pleasant to write about. I'm just remembering, I think her name was Katherine Gerbner. And it's a William and Mary Quarterly article, probably 2 or 3 years old now. That's about the Thistlewood Diaries.
I'll be sure to pass that. So thank you. So 2 more questions, and then I'll give you back your day because it's still pretty early where you are. So what has been most interesting to you about the past of Black studies as a field or a discipline? Both, you can in the academy, outside of the academy, like what is interesting to you about Black studies in the past?
Oh, there's so many things that are interesting. I would say for me, one of the, I would say stakes, because they're real world, life-changing kinds of stakes for me, has been the way that different communities across time have managed to create solidarity networks with one another. So whether it's, Black Americans in New York singing songs about the Haitian Revolution, I'm thinking here about Leslie Alexander's work, right? Whether it's, or individuals, I'm thinking about work that was captured in an 1838 painting in Jamaica where the enslaved dressed as French set girls, right? And they dressed in particular ways that, when I looked at it, I was like, oh, they're trying to, this is a signifying practice about the Haitian Revolution that they're bringing to, with them into Jamaica. So it's those moments where people understand that solidarity is very, very important, and work together to try, to change their life circumstances and their given locale. So in other words, they're very concentrated on local politics, but they understand that it's always necessary to look at the communities that are also right around that, work at communities internationally. That to me has been one of the sustaining features. It's one of the ongoing kind of preoccupations of not just the field, but of people who are, whether they're doing activist work or they're writers or what have you. I in my first book, I wrote a lot about Black newspapers, that were coming out of Martinique and Haiti and the United States, and the way that they were all reading news about each other, right? They were making sure the audience and their readers knew what was happening in other places. So just the communication networks that we've established across time with one another have been really important to me. And those moments that we think about, solidarity and work with other communities, whether they're Native American communities, Asian American communities, Chicano, Latinx communities, that, even getting to the Black Studies Project has been really important to us, to have these series where we're looking at similar issues, similar and dissimilar. It doesn't always have to be similar, but I'm thinking in particular of a speaker that we brought who founded an organization of mothers who've lost children to police violence in Brazil. Just even thinking about it, it was she's just amazing. But making sure that people in San Diego know about these struggles that are happening in Brazil at the moment around Black power and Black safety, Black organizing methods, right? The role that women play in these organizations, as founders, as people who keep the memories of their lost ones and alive, right? So that to me, I think, is one of the most important one of the things that makes me believe in the power of this work, both in the present, but also when we're thinking about future iterations of it, and certainly what people were concerned about in the past.
So that kind of bled into that final question about the future. But I guess particularly given everything that is happening right now, um, what's one or maybe two, because it's hard to pick one, like what's a question that Black Studies should be asking right now?
I think that one question we can be asking is, how do we not capitulate? How do we not comply in advance, so to speak, with policies that say what we study is not important, that say that the communities that we serve and that we write about and that we work with are not important? How do we protect those communities against what is truly, an onslaught of continuous methods that are used to denigrate people's memories? I mean, Harriet Tubman shouldn't be taught when we're talking about the Civil War, please. She was a major figure in the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War.
Right.
Of course, her name on buildings, or it should be taught in school books. These kinds of things. The removal. Again, since I work in a lot of archives, it's obviously very disturbing to see databases and archives that used to be online disappearing in front of our eyes. These kinds of things. I think that would be a major question. I know it's a question that I'm asking myself every day. How do I take what I've learned from this community and in this field, and how do I apply it in what are very, very disturbing times. But again, this discipline was born in disturbing times. This is not something that's coming out of nowhere.
Yeah. And
that's one of the joys of Black Studies, is seeing how people are resilient and creative, and they make do with seemingly nothing under these systems of profound oppression, and they still manage to, sometimes to thrive, certainly to, have communities and, to raise children and teach children. And we still manage to do these things, right?
Mm-hmm. And there's so much that you can look to the past of Black Studies for, with the strategies and ideas and things. Like you said, people have done it, so it's there. And thinking about what we can take from what's been done and use and update and invent and all of the things. Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. If anything, we are very trained, very well trained, to figure out what could possibly come next, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
For editors who were trying to do this when their printing presses were being burned, when, there was a campaign against Black journalism. I mean, these things, the attacks against the press, all of these things, they have a long...
Yes. Is there anything else you want to add or end on before I give you back the rest of your day?
Thank you again. I think these podcasts, I really enjoyed listening to them. And they're really a gift to all of us, getting to hear each other think about these questions. And so thank you for putting in all the time and labor and energy to make this a really meaningful space for not just the present moment, but something that we can hand down.
Well, thank you. It would not be possible without scholars and activists and artists and amazing people in Black Studies like yourself who agree to continue having conversations. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you're continuing to do. It's really impactful, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And best of luck to your sister. I can't wait to read that dissertation.
Thank you.
I'll look for it.
Bye.
Have a good afternoon.